You are listening to the Neurocareers, Doing the Impossible podcast with Dr. K, episode number 15. Dear listeners, we continue our podcast series about careers in neuroscience and neurotechnologies. And today, our guest, Sasha Soreff from New York, in the United States of America, will be guiding us on this exciting journey. Hello, Sasha.
Hello, Melina. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming to help us to figure out various careers that are related to brain sciences. And because we have this international podcast, where people from different countries all over the world are talking about their careers in neuroscience-related fields, I would like to ask you just very briefly introduce where are you from and also tell us about yourself.
Sure. I am right now in New York City, although I was born in Maine and I have a great love of the ocean. And I am a choreographer and dance teacher. And at a certain point, I started studying nonviolent communication, which led me into interpersonal neurobiology and exploring ways to bring interpersonal neurobiology and movement together.
It sounds very exciting what you are doing, and choreographer and dance teacher and the connection to interpersonal neurobiology, nonviolent communication. So let's start exploring all that. What came first?
Dance came first. I started dancing when I was 5 years old. My first piece, my professional debut was in a piece called Feeding the Ducks. I was 5 years old and it was at a home for seniors in Portland, Maine.
That's so beautiful. So 5 years old and here you are still continuing with the dance. So it looks that it's your passion, the passion of your life.
I do love it. And I think there is something primal and life-affirming to move, to dance, to move in whatever ways.
Probably this is something that also resonated with you when you looked at interpersonal neurobiology, because that specific emphasis on the body, that we all have bodies. So can you tell more about that and your first interaction with this field, and then how did it evolve?
Sure. First, I want to say we do all have bodies. And for some of us, our relationship with our bodies is quite complicated. So I want to acknowledge that some of us have had serious illness or pain or physical limitations or challenges. Some of us came to learn that being in our heads was the way to move forward in life. And so we became very cerebral and maybe we became very successful, but in a very head-oriented way. So I want to acknowledge that it is not easy, obvious, comfortable, or safe for many of us to actually be in our bodies. And one of the gifts of interpersonal neurobiology is to open the door to being in one's body in a way that feels okay, that feels tolerable, and ultimately feels healing. For me, I had always had an experience as a dancer of being, on some level, very comfortable moving. But there were other ways that I was very disconnected from my somatic self. I could dance, but I didn't always know what I was feeling. And so these practices that are so important in interpersonal neurobiology, these practices to actually say, what's happening in my body right now? What sensations are happening? And what if I gave that sensation a feeling or emotional word, what would it be? Even for a dancer, it's not automatic. And so it was a real revelation to me to learn to come into my body and say, oh, you know what? My belly is contracting right now. I wonder if there's something going on, if I'm feeling fear or apprehension, or, oh, you know what? My heart is racing right now. Like these things. I just wonder, as we're talking, Lena, if it would be okay if we just ask the listeners to take a moment and just notice, are you holding your breath in this moment? Are you able to draw breath in? Do you have sensation? Are you aware of your belly? Are you aware of your heart? Sometimes we hold tension in our throats. Does it feel like your throat is constricted or does it feel open? You may or may not be able to connect in this moment. And even just having the invitation is like an invitation to the nervous system that we are curious about the experience of being us, of being me, of being you right now.
That's beautiful. I did. I answered all the questions you were asking, and it immediately calmed me down. That's just a couple of seconds that we were doing it, and it, in fact, had immediate effect. Thank you, Sasha. I'm sure our listeners also appreciated that quick exercise, quick glance into what you are doing. So, what changed for you after you started going deeper into this science of interpersonal neurobiology? What changes did you notice that were happening with you?
I would say it's changes I've noticed in myself as well as people I work with. There is such a relief in having lived experience named. So for me, I reflect on moments in my life, especially in my younger life, that felt challenging. And even though, again, I was dancing, on some level, I was numb. I wasn't in touch with what I was really feeling. And I wasn't in touch with what I was feeling because it seemed like it would overwhelm me. And I think a lot of us have that experience, that it's a little daunting to turn inward if you don't know how it's going to go. And so the experience of nonviolent communication and more the parts of nonviolent communication that are explicitly grounded in interpersonal neurobiology is to experience a sense of knowing that my experience matters and that my experience makes sense. And that begins to give me a little more space to actually wonder about my experience and to touch into grief or rage or fear or this sense of being so alone that I think so many of us can relate to at different moments.
Absolutely. And I think those emotions that you were talking about, we tend not to acknowledge. We try to shove them away and simply not think about it. Usually, we want to experience positive emotions such as joy, other positive emotions, and all other emotions. They are still there. We still experience them. We still have a memory of them. However, they untouched. Can you tell how did you integrate this possibility to connect with those different emotions into your dance? What happened?
Yeah, I think I want to answer this in two parts. First, I want to say it makes so much sense that it is hard to touch grief and rage and fear and loneliness, aloneness, especially if it doesn't feel like we have the support to do it. It might feel even worse to do it. And so in my journey with interpersonal neurobiology, I became connected to a community that really focuses on this idea of resonance. It is really important that someone is holding your experience with warm curiosity. Dr. Daniel Siegel talks about resonance. He describes it with guitar strings, and he describes this way that you can be with someone and be curious about their experience, but not be lost in the experience. So you're not sliding into someone else's feelings, but you're being with them in the experience of the feelings. And my mentor in this, Sarah Payton, talks about a resonating self-witness. And the resonating self-witness is a way of describing really the prefrontal cortex. It's a way of almost personifying like that capacity to have warm curiosity for one's own experience. Now, in my experience, to develop a resonating self-witness means I need other people resonating with me first. I need the experience of other people saying, "You make sense." And then I begin to develop the capacity to do that for myself. So that's part one. That's the context in which part two, the movement, emerges. My experience is being in a resonance-based conversation of me saying, this thing happened, this is how I feel about it, and having someone say, that makes sense. You make sense. Of course you feel sad about that. That is one level of resonance. I became curious as a dancer how to bring movement expression into the process of resonance, because sometimes we can be so in the part of our brains that wants to figure things out and solve things that it can be hard to access the parts of our brain that are holding the feelings, how we feel about what happened. So I started working with this idea of a resonating movement witness so that I can tune into the experience inside myself and others with words and with movement. And by movement, I mean something as simple as raising my eyebrows or frowning. That is movement. So is letting my hands move. So that if I want to really connect and affirm that I understand something, I might say, "Oh, are you feeling sad?" And maybe I'll put my hands on my heart and say, "Oh, are you feeling sad? My heart hurts when I hear you tell me this story. What happens for you?" So movement becomes another way of helping us tune in to what the experience is and how it feels.
Thank you, Sasha. In a way, you are emphasizing verbal and nonverbal communication, the expression of our face, our gestures, and they are gaining a meaning. They become more meaningful. Actually, used in a conscious way because we are expressing something with our movement, with our gestures, and doing it consciously in a way.
Yes, absolutely. And in this approach, there is also the room to really dance. And by dance, I mean move your body however you want to move. I find that it can be very powerful to put on a piece of music and start moving. And that moving can be standing if you have the physical capacity to do that, so that maybe you start with swaying your body side to side. And then you listen to the music and you just see where your body wants to go. It can also be done seated. I'm sitting now, and although I'm not visible, I'm swaying back and forth as I experience this with gestures, with putting your hands up. And movement can even be sitting with your eyes closed in a meditative state, just imagining movement. All of these things help us get in touch with the relational part of the brain, take us out of instrumental and into the relational, where we can access the feelings.
That's beautiful. And when you were talking about sitting simply with your eyes closed and imagining the movement, I remembered about the podcast of Dr. Elena Salias from Spain, uh, who is a cognitive neuroscientist. At the same time, she does contemporary dance. And in her podcast, she was saying that you can sit with your eyes closed and imagine yourself moving, and movement is what sets you free. So that's a nice echo of what we already talked before. That's beautiful. And when you talked, you know what came to my mind? The history of dance. It goes thousands and thousands years back. Its origins are so archaic, all tribal dance. There were dances that were done in temples for the gods. And it has such a profound history. And from your explanation, I remembered about it and I think connected to that time. I think it's really powerful, even from this perspective. And somehow we really forget about its power of movement, power of dance. Very often we sit the whole day without moving in front of the computers. We're doing different things, and we are very depriving ourselves from the movement. And this podcast, we are targeting students, graduates who are looking for different new opportunities, also for people who are changing their job, maybe from academia to different areas. What do you think movement and even dance or dance therapy can do for people who are mostly used to think?
I think there are a couple ways that dance and movement can be really valuable. And I want to reiterate that dance does not have to mean taking a class. And dance does not have to look a certain way at all. I think dance and movement can be valuable. First of all, moving can stimulate new ideas. Moving and inviting yourself to use other parts of your brain, being in space, coordination. If you're listening to music, taking in the sound. If you are moving in a space with other people or in your own apartment, you're seeing visually what's going on. It changes your relationship with the space that you're in. So already, for any student who is studying super hard, just moving a little bit will probably be really conducive to learning and remembering what you're learning. So that's just the first thing. The second thing is this very specific way of working with movement that I call resonant movement, which is what we were talking about before, which is how can movement express what I'm experiencing now and help me witness my own experience. So I imagine something that happens a lot when one is studying and one has big deadlines and one is trying to get research completed and get assignments finished and find the work that you really want to do. It can be pretty stressful. So just moving around is helpful. Endorphins flowing, serotonin flowing, just change the brain chemistry a little bit. But then there's also this idea of being in resonance with your own experience. Do you need acknowledgement that you are so stressed right now? You feel like your brain is going to pop out of your head. And maybe as I'm saying that question, that resonant guess, I'm also going to do movement of what that looks like. Maybe I put my hands next to my head and I shake them like, oh my goodness, my head. So there's the general ways that movement can be so valuable, even just to take literally 15 seconds to shake your body, which is a beautiful Qigong practice to move the energy. But there's also doing resonant movement to try and express, how do I feel in this moment?
Yes, absolutely. I think those are very useful tips because what we are usually doing, as I already was talking about this, trying even not to feel that we're stressed, which leads actually very often to procrastination. Yes, we're thinking, what is procrastination? Of course, there are different opinions about that. Some people may say that it's a lack of strong will. However, I think these are all those trapped emotions that we just don't want to acknowledge. We don't want to feel anxious. We don't want to feel stress, and rightfully so, but they're still inside us. We are still feeling it. And in order not to feel, we are running to the fridge and eating something or just playing on the phone, which often very happens with students. And then at the very last moment, when we already don't have any exit, we try to do something. However, if movement and this acknowledgement of emotions expressed in movement can help us actually to feel and process those emotions, we might be able, without any additional time effort, to sit and actually do what we need to do. So, one way to beat procrastination. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Procrastination makes so much sense for anyone who really wants to do well. And the fear of not doing well is really present. And so procrastination, of course, it makes so much sense that you don't want to start something if you're afraid it's not going to do well. So in that case, something Sarah Payton says all the time is, of course you don't want to start doing something that's not going well. To say this phrase, of course, to yourself, that's a way of being resonant. Of course you feel that way. And so in movement, I would feel curious about two things. First, when I'm procrastinating, what am I not feeling in my body? Like, what am I trying to distance myself from? If I'm going to distraction or doing other things, what don't I want to feel? And maybe what I don't want to feel is the fear, because it's so important to me that I do well, that I contribute in the world the way I want to contribute. And so that is so much pressure. And even as I'm talking about this, I feel right now in this moment, like I feel like this contraction by my heart. I feel like this sense of heaviness. And so maybe in that moment of, I know I should work on this, but I just can't bring myself to do it. Is there a way to be curious about what's going on? And maybe there's a way to ask someone to be on your support team for this, because it can be hard to deal with these big feelings alone. So the question might be, do you need acknowledgement that when you think about doing this paper, it feels like a 2,000-pound weight just lands on your head? And then maybe as I'm describing that, maybe I want to make a movement that describes the contraction that my heart is feeling right now. Like maybe I want to make myself into a little ball physically, which is almost a way. It's almost like I am sending the message to my nervous system. I hear you. I hear that something's going on, and I want to really understand specifically what's going on. The more precise the wondering about the experience, the more potential relief that the nervous system's message has been received. So with words and or with movement, sometimes in different moments, words feel easier. Sometimes it's really hard to reach for words, and that just feels even more overwhelming. And just doing a little movement can just help the body know, hey, I'm paying attention. I see that something's going on. Oh, are you feeling scared and small and contracted because you really want to do a good job? Yeah. And then see what happens. What we're looking for is a change in the body, that there's like more of a sense of relaxation that lets us know the message has been received.
Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely. Absolutely. I hope students are listening and already experimenting with this. Sasha, can you tell what's created when you came up with this resonating movement witness idea?
What is created is another pathway for self-awareness and for understanding what we want and need. One of the things that I find so powerful about interpersonal neurobiology is it says that your brain makes sense and your brain can change in a way that makes life better, that makes it more possible to know your own heart, to know your dreams, to soothe yourself when you're distressed, and to be in relationship with other people and to be curious about what their dreams are and what their distress is. And movement is another way of expanding that gives us even more access to our bodies, even more access to our own experiences, and even more access to knowing you make sense.
Yes, it does make sense. Sasha, in terms of your career, when you started working with this idea of resonating movement witness, what did you start doing differently that you did before?
I am more present. I am a better listener. I have more curiosity and space to be curious about my own experience and the experience of other people. And earlier in our conversation, I was talking about moments in my life where I just was numb, where it was too hard for me to be with the big feelings that come up. And through this process of resonance in words and in movement, I am more able to be with myself in those moments of fear or sadness or aloneness. And when I can do that, I get more of my life back because I had to put a lot of energy into keeping those hard experiences at bay. And so little by little, it's like I'm touching into various unfelt feelings for a long time, feelings that were sort of frozen in me. As I have more ability to be with those difficult moments, then I get more of myself back. I have more energy. I have more capacity for joy. And as I mentioned, I have more presence to be with myself and others.
Absolutely. And working with the emotions has this effect. Many people who are working with their emotions notice that they start to have more energy when they acknowledge their emotions, when they let themselves feel them, whatever the emotions are, positive or so-called negative, although I wouldn't classify them as such. But yes, in general.
And I would add more sense of acceptance when there isn't more energy or when things are hard. My experience in this journey is that shame can come up a lot. I have experienced in my own journey, I should be further along. I should be able to do certain things. To go back to the procrastination example, I shouldn't procrastinate. I know better. Rationally, I know that it's not going to help me, but I can't get myself to do it, right? And so stepping in with resonance can really change these painful and shameful experiences to a kind of, oh, of course you feel shame right now. And I want to name that because I think sometimes it doesn't even feel okay to admit to feeling shame. But in this realm where we turn toward difficult or big feelings, shame is definitely one of them.
Yes, absolutely. Working with the people as a coach, this comes up in almost every session. So that's so important not to be ashamed to feel that shame and process it. I absolutely agree. Sasha, I know that about 2 years ago, when COVID hit the world, you started something that brought people possibility to deal with those difficult emotions. Can you tell the story?
Absolutely. When the world changed in 2020, I saw inside myself and in everyone with whom I was interacting so much sense of fear, the sense of overwhelm and uncertainty and isolation has been so palpable. I started offering what I call empathy movement workshops online. So these were spaces to come together and be in resonant community with words and movement to explore and express these big things that we were feeling. So every month we come together on Zoom and there's a different theme. The theme that I have come to the most over and over is grief. It feels so important to have spaces where we can express the grief that we're feeling. There are those of us who lost people in COVID. There are those of us who lost people or whether during COVID or before, who are just navigating the loss of a loved one. There is the loss of dreams, of things that one hoped for and that the pandemic derailed. There is the loss of relationships. There's so many layers of grief. And so one of the things about interpersonal neurobiology is that we can be changed by our connections. Our brains can be changed for the better by our connections and by accompanying each other in this way, in this resonant way. So coming together as a group and getting to share about our experiences and then move in a community, even off camera, but knowing that you're not alone. And then coming back after listening to music and meditating or moving and saying, oh my goodness, I got in touch with something inside myself. And then to be witnessed for that can be really transformative. So these empathy movement spaces have been a way to hold the big feelings in community, to see each other in our experiences.
Yeah. Yes, that's beautiful. And what I noticed that I think is very important in what you said, that there are so different forms of grief. We are used to the standard approach to grief. Grief is when somebody loses somebody, a family member passes away, or a dear friend. However, grief happens so often in many other areas of life. Losing a job that the person really was involved in, or not getting maybe a promotion that somebody was expecting, maybe lost plans for the life change that the person was expecting to have. Even a grade that the student wanted to get, and it was his ultimate goal. And for some people, it's really very, very deep emotion. And some people are sincerely grieving about things like that. So it happens on so many levels and so much more often than we really think about it. Did you notice this when working with people? All those various forms of grief, and how do people approach it, and how does your form of movement therapy helps to approach grief in all the situations?
All of those kinds of grief. And also, I just want to add the grief of losing well-being for people who got COVID or who have come into a different kind of illness or change in physical capacity. So a very deep experience of a loss of well-being is also comes up a lot. The first thing that happens in this space is there is the relief of knowing that you are not alone, that you are not the only one who is experiencing grief. That's the first thing that happens. Then, what I have witnessed many times over is that when a person touches into one layer of grief, it opens up all the grief of their lifetime that maybe didn't get acknowledged along the way. And so there's this very powerful healing that can be for the whole person. It can touch into their history, maybe not all at once, but maybe all at once. For some people, it happens very quickly. For some people, it's over and over by being with these practices over time. And it's almost like acknowledging young hurts that never got acknowledged before because there wasn't the space and the capacity to acknowledge that. And being in this kind of group setting that is oriented toward resonant words and movement, there's the space, little by little or a lot, to let some of these experiences and memories come forward.
Thank you, Sasha. If we have students who are listening to this podcast and they're thinking, why should I let myself to experience this grief so that it would open more and more and more areas where I felt that grief? Isn't it just easier for me not to deal with it? What would be your answer?
Well, the first thing I would say is, of course, you don't want to open the door to an avalanche of grief. It is my observation and it is my own personal experience that one can keep the door closed only for so long. And at a certain point, keeping the door closed means sacrificing access to one's whole, full life. I wonder if it feels more possible or hopeful to know that you don't have to open the door and let in an avalanche of grief all at once. That you can have someone or a group of people accompany you. And that's what all of the resonance in words and movement, verbal and nonverbal, is all about, is creating accompaniment, because it actually makes a lot of sense not to open the door to all that grief if you're just alone with a very critical brain, as many of our brains are. What makes it doable is the accompaniment of not being alone, of being with people who can see you and say you make sense, and learning to do that for yourself. And I wonder if it feels better to imagine doing that, knowing that there's support to do it, and it can be as slow or as fast as your nervous system feels safe doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Sasha. I hope that your suggestion is heard. Can you tell us, in terms of developing your program, this movement therapy program, and offering it to people, what was the most difficult part for you, and how did you overcome it, and what did you learn in the process?
Well, with these empathy movement workshops, and I like calling them empathy movement because I like making it clear that there are these two parts of it that are interacting. I think it's been important for me to know that not everyone is ready to step toward this, and to really trust that when a person feels curious, they will come. And that this work is so tender that it is really important that people step toward it and that they move at their own pace. And so for me, it's been a learning of how to create the space and keep the space open for people to come in wherever they are in their journey when they feel ready to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Sasha. As the time goes forward, what are your plans? How do you want to develop your workshops, the work on empathy movement that you are doing? How do you imagine yourself maybe in 10 or even in 20 years from now?
How I imagine myself is in connection with more and more people who could really benefit from this way of empathy movement, engaging with empathy movement. I see these workshops growing to different settings. I would love to see it in universities and to be of support to students and faculty and researchers. I would love to see empathy movement, this kind of resonance practice in schools more and more. It's in some, but even more in prisons, in senior centers, in not for profits, in corporations. Really, there's no limit. And I think the opportunity is that as more people discover these resonant practices, then they want those practices to be more widely available in their schools and the places that they work and in their communal lives.
That's a beautiful future. Thank you, Sasha. I really wish you all the best on implementing all those beautiful dreams. Another question I have is about the main topic of our podcast. Our podcast is called Neurocareers Doing the Impossible. What becomes possible that wasn't possible before for people who start working with their emotions, who allow themselves to experience them? What possibilities does this open?
When a brain changes from a critical orientation, from an instrumental orientation, into a more relational orientation, integrating feelings and experiences and expressions, I think that is a brain that has more access to creativity and imagination and to seeing possibilities that aren't yet present. I think precisely what happens is the possible becomes possible.
Thank you, Sasha. And the question was born in me when I was listening to you, because you started the podcast talking how you were dancing when you were 5 years old. So now, from this space where you are creating this beautiful empathy movement program, when you got in touch with the many of your emotions, what do you tell to your past 5-year-old self, what advice would you give her growing up? What would you come and just tell her right now?
I would tell her that it is beautiful to dance and to move. And it is especially beautiful to dance and movement sometimes, to self-expression, to letting it be a way of moving through life with access to emotions. And that movement can become a way of expressing and processing and learning and making new connections that are beyond the rational mind. So she should hang in there and look forward to that.
Sorry. And she did. And she did. That's beautiful. Sasha, what are possible ways to learn more about your program? Maybe to connect with you, to those who are interested in working with their emotions through movement, or maybe to those who might want to connect their careers with this field?
I welcome hearing from anyone who is curious about that. I would love to imagine that with you. My website is the best way to reach me, to fill out the contact information form there, and I will follow up. And my website is sashasoreffdance.com. I'll spell it SASHA, S as in Sam, OREFF as in Frank, dance.com. SashaSoreffDance.com.
Thank you. And we will also add this information into our podcast note. Is there anything, the last thing in this podcast that you might wish to our students or graduates or scientists who are working on projects, theses, and getting stressed and getting anxious? If so, what would that be?
Well, first, I want to say thank you for the work you're doing. It is really important. And I know you are working hard and I really appreciate it. And so does everyone who is the beneficiary of your research, your scholarship, and what you are bringing forward. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is, are you willing to take 15 seconds to just move your body right now? Or are you willing to take 15 seconds to tune inside and say, oh, what am I sensing? Do I have any sensations going on in my body? And to do that as many times as you think of it in the days to come, and see how that feels for you. See how it feels.
Thank you so much, Sasha. It has been such a great pleasure having you on our podcast. And I'm looking to talking with you maybe in a year or so and seeing how everything progressed and where you are with the program and what happens with people, with the outcomes that you are seeing, that your program is producing. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Milena. This has been such a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Sasha.